The city was half asleep. Outside, the streets of New York shimmered under a thin winter haze, each streetlight flickering like it was tired of its own glow. Inside a small studio apartment, Ethan Cole sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone in the dim blue light. His coffee had gone cold. The silence was heavy enough to hum. He wasn't miserable, not exactly. Just stuck. 28 years old, decent job at a marketing firm, bills paid on time, parents proud enough to brag. And yet every night felt the same. A blur of screens, snacks, and that familiar thought, I could be doing more with my life. He paused when a thumbnail popped up on YouTube. How to be disciplined. Book review. He almost scrolled past it. Discipline? The word itself made him roll his eyes. He'd tried 100 life-changing routines before, gym memberships, productivity apps, even a 30-day challenge that lasted exactly 3 days. But something in him twitched, that quiet guilt that whispers when you know you've been coasting. Without thinking too much, he clicked. The reviewer talked about a book called How to Be Disciplined by Sheldon Howe, about people who turned their chaos into order, not overnight, but one choice at a time. When the video ended, Ethan sat still for a few seconds. Then he opened a new tab, ordered the book, and shut his laptop. He didn't believe in signs, but this felt close. 3 days later, the delivery guy handed him a small brown package. The moment he tore it open, the smell of fresh pages hit him. That strange mix of ink and possibility. He brewed a cup of strong black coffee, wrapped himself in a blanket, and stepped out to his tiny balcony overlooking the street. Cold wind brushed his face. He opened the book. The first chapter's title glared back at him. Set clear goals. He read slowly, like someone reading instructions for living. Setting clear, achievable goals is the foundation of discipline. Goals give you direction and purpose, making it easier to stay focused and measure progress. He stopped there. The words were simple, almost obvious, but they landed hard. Direction, focus, progress. 3 things he didn't have. He stared at the skyline, lights blinking like reminders of other people's ambitions. For years, his own goals had been foggy. Get fit, start something of my own, be better. But he'd never written them down, never measured them. Maybe that was the real reason nothing ever changed. Then another line caught his eye. If you don't know where you're going, you'll never get there. That one hit like a punch. He closed the book, grabbed a notebook from his desk, and began writing. The first words felt awkward, like learning to walk again. But slowly, the sentences took shape. 1. Lose 10 kilograms in 6 months. 2. Finish 3 advanced digital marketing courses. 3. Read 5 new books every month. He looked at the list, surprised by how specific it felt, how real. For the first time in a long time, his life had coordinates. When he finally went to bed that night, something strange happened. His mind was quiet, not happy, not ecstatic, just calm. The next morning, his alarm rang at 6. He stared at it, half awake. His body screamed to stay in bed. He hit snooze. 5 more minutes, he mumbled. 5 minutes became an hour. When he finally opened his eyes, it was 7:30. He cursed under his breath, frustration rising fast. Then he remembered a line from the book. Failure is part of the process. Don't be discouraged by small setbacks. Focus on getting back on track. He laughed softly. Guess I'm part of the process now. That evening, he taped a large sheet of paper to the wall. On it, he rewrote his goals and drew tiny boxes next to each one. A simple rule. Check 1 box every time you move forward. The chart looked childish, but it felt powerful. For the next few days, he kept trying. Some mornings he ran, some mornings he didn't, but each attempt left him a little lighter, a little sharper. The winter air bit his skin as he jogged around the park before sunrise. His breath turned to mist, his heartbeat thumped in his ears, and for the first time in years he felt alive. He didn't know it yet, but that night on the balcony with a cup of coffee and a thin book in his hands, he had taken the first real step toward changing everything. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet tug-of-war between who Ethan was and who he was trying to become. Some mornings he woke before the alarm, pulled on his running shoes and felt unstoppable. Other days he hit snooze 5 times, lying there watching the light crawl across his ceiling, bargaining with his own excuses. But every time he slipped, he picked the book back up, and that alone was new. One Friday night, as the wind scraped against his window and the city drowned in weekend noise, Ethan opened the second chapter. Develop a routine. The first line was bold. A consistent daily routine builds habits that reinforce discipline. He exhaled through his nose. A routine, he muttered. The one thing I've never managed to keep. The book continued. Structure minimizes distraction and gives the mind a rhythm to follow. Freedom is found not in chaos, but in clarity. That line got him. Maybe he didn't need motivation. Maybe he just needed a rhythm, something stable enough to stop his mind from wandering off course every 2 days. He opened his notebook and wrote on a blank page in bold letters, "My perfect routine." Under it, he began mapping out his day like a military plan. Wake up at 6, work out from 6:15 to 7, breakfast at 7:30, work from 8 to noon, lunch at 12, deep work again from 1 to 5, read, learn, or journal from 6 to 7, sleep by 10. When he finished, he leaned back and looked at it, the simplest schedule in the world, and somehow it terrified him. Easy to write, he thought, harder to live. The next morning, the alarm screamed at 6. Ethan groaned, rolled over and stared at the clock. The cold air outside the blanket felt like punishment, but he remembered the chapter's line. Freedom is found in clarity. He swung his legs off the bed. Fine, he muttered. Let's see how clear this feels. The first few days were rough. His body ached, his eyes stung, his mind cursed him for trying. He burned his eggs twice, missed the bus once, fell asleep during a Zoom call, but he kept showing up. The book had warned him. Habits are difficult at first, messy in the middle, effortless at the end. He was somewhere deep in the messy part. By the end of the second week, something shifted. He no longer had to think about waking up. His body just did it. He began to like the quiet of early mornings, the sound of the city stretching awake, the way the sky blushed from black to pale gold. Routine was no longer a cage. It was a compass. At work, his boss noticed. "Ethan, your reports have been sharp lately. You seem more focused," he said one afternoon. Ethan smiled. "Just sleeping better," he lied. He wasn't sleeping better. He was living better. But discipline, he learned, always comes with its own temptations. One Sunday evening, his friend Aaron texted, "Movie night, man. You in?" Ethan stared at his planner. Sunday night was his review and reset slot, his time to reflect and plan the week. He hesitated. If he said no, he'd feel like a robot. If he said yes, he'd feel like a failure. Then a sentence from the chapter came to him. Routine doesn't mean rigidity. Leave space for life. He closed the book, smiled, and replied, "I'm in." The next day he woke up on time, hit the gym, and nailed every task on his list. Missing one night hadn't broken his flow. It had made it stronger. He understood now. Discipline wasn't about living like a monk. It was about balance. Weeks later, his wall chart was filling with check marks. The sight of it made him proud, not for the boxes he'd ticked, but for the days he hadn't given up. His routine had become his anchor. When life got noisy, he had something steady to hold on to. One night, as he closed the book, he whispered, "Okay, Sheldon Howe, you've got my attention." But he didn't know. The next chapter would test everything he'd just built. By the end of the month, Ethan's life had a shape again. His mornings belonged to running shoes and cold air, his nights to books and quiet reflection. The wall chart by his bed was filling up with tiny check marks, proof that he was no longer drifting. But all it took to shake that piece was a couch, a screen, and a play next episode button. One evening after work, he told himself he'd rest for 10 minutes before starting his nightly reading. 10 minutes turned into 3 hours. When the credits rolled, the weight of disappointment pressed on his chest. The chart stared back at him like a judge. He muttered, "So much for discipline," and opened How to Be Disciplined Again. The next chapter was waiting. Embrace self-control. The first line hit hard. Self-control is the gatekeeper of discipline. Without it, every goal is a theory waiting to collapse. He closed his eyes and exhaled. That was him, a man full of theories. The book continued. Temptations rarely look dangerous. They disguise themselves as small rewards. He looked down at his phone glowing on the table, at the delivery app icon calling his name. Harmless rewards, he whispered. The next morning he declared war on his distractions. He deleted every app that didn't serve a purpose. He turned off notifications. He even placed his phone in the kitchen drawer while working. The silence felt strange, almost hostile. He hadn't realized how addicted he was to the tiny buzz of validation. By noon, he'd reached for the phone 5 times. By evening, 10. Each time he caught himself, frustration flared. Why is this so hard? The book's line echoed back. Every time you resist a temptation, you become the person you wish to be. He smiled bitterly. Guess I'm earning character points today. That night he cooked dinner without scrolling through anything. The quiet of his apartment was loud enough to feel physical. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the scrape of his fork against the plate. For once, his mind wasn't jumping between tabs and timelines. It was here. Still. The next test came sooner than expected. Saturday evening, his friends texted, "Bar tonight, you coming?" He stared at the screen. He hadn't gone out in weeks. His routine was sacred now. Read, plan, sleep early. But another voice inside whispered, "One night won't kill it." He stood there for a long time, phone in hand. Then he asked himself one question. Will this take me closer to who I want to become? The answer was clear. He typed back, "Can't tonight. Big day tomorrow." He wasn't lying. Tomorrow was the day he'd start building the new campaign plan for work. When he woke up the next morning, sunlight spilled across his desk. The city was quiet. He brewed coffee, opened his notebook, and felt a rare calm settle in. Saying no the night before hadn't made him miss out. It had given him space to move forward. Days passed, and small victories stacked up. He resisted the dessert after lunch. He stopped checking his phone before bed. He skipped the unnecessary online arguments he used to dive into for no reason. Each time he walked away from something easy, he gained something invisible. Control. One afternoon, he read a line that glued itself to his brain. Discipline is choosing between what you want now and what you want most. He wrote it on a sticky note and pinned it to his monitor. It stared back at him every day, a quiet challenge. Over time, he realized self-control wasn't about cutting joy out of life. It was about protecting what mattered. He could still enjoy movies, food, or nights out, as long as he chose them, not escaped into them. By the end of that month, he deleted the word motivation from his vocabulary. Motivation was a spark. Control was the fire that kept burning. One night, as rain drummed gently against the window, he closed the book and whispered, "I think I'm starting to get it." He poured himself a cup of tea instead of opening another app, leaned back and listened to the sound of the storm. Self-control, he realized, wasn't loud. It didn't look heroic. It was quiet, stubborn, invisible. And maybe that's why it worked. A few weeks later, Ethan found himself in a strange space, the kind that hides between progress and peace. His routine was solid, his focus sharper than ever, yet something still felt noisy. His body followed structure, but his mind wandered like a restless child. During meetings, he'd zone out mid-sentence. While reading, he'd drift into thoughts of old regrets or future plans. He was doing everything right, but his thoughts were never here. One night, tired of the chatter inside his head, he opened the book again. The next chapter read, "Practice mindfulness." The first line said, "Discipline is not only about action, it's about awareness. You can't control your life if you can't control your attention." He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. That hit home. He wasn't losing battles outside, he was losing them inside. The book went on. The mind is like a monkey, always jumping from one branch of thought to another. Mindfulness is learning how to let the monkey rest. He chuckled softly. Yeah, he said aloud, mine's a whole jungle. The next morning after his run, he decided to try something new. No music, no noise, just 10 minutes of silence. He sat on the floor, crossed his legs, and closed his eyes. At first it was chaos. Every thought barged in, a forgotten email, an unpaid bill, an old argument. The more he tried to silence them, the louder they got. But then he remembered another line from the book. Mindfulness is not about stopping thoughts. It's about observing them without judgment and gently returning to the present. So he stopped fighting. He just watched. His thoughts came and went like waves hitting the shore. Gradually the storm began to settle. After 10 minutes he opened his eyes. The world looked softer. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint rumble of traffic below. It all felt calm, like the volume of life had turned down just enough for him to breathe again. He made it part of his morning routine. 10 minutes became 15, then 20. It didn't always go smoothly. Some days his mind was a circus, some days a quiet lake, but he kept showing up. Weeks later, the results began to show, not on his body, but on his reactions. When co-workers argued, he didn't snap. When plans changed, he didn't spiral. When he made mistakes, he didn't drown in self-blame. He just breathed. One afternoon, during a stressful project meeting, his manager threw last-minute changes at him. The old Ethan would have panicked. Instead, he inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower, and said, "Got it." The room went silent for a moment, then moved on. After the meeting, a colleague asked, "How do you stay so calm all the time?" He smiled. "I just breathe a lot." But mindfulness wasn't just helping at work. It was reshaping his personal life. He started calling his mother more often, actually listening instead of half-scrolling. He began noticing the way sunlight hit his desk in the mornings, how coffee tasted slightly different each day. He stopped eating lunch at his desk and started eating at the park instead. The book had said, "Presence sharpens gratitude. Gratitude strengthens discipline." And that was exactly what was happening. One evening after dinner, Ethan sat on his balcony again. The city lights blinked in the distance like distant stars. The air was cool still. He felt content, not the kind that comes from achievement, but the kind that comes from alignment. He looked down at the open book on his lap and read the last line of the chapter. "The present moment is the only place where life truly happens. Learn to live there." He whispered, "Yeah, I get that now." And for once he didn't just understand it. He felt it. He closed the book, took one last deep breath, and smiled. Because the next step, learning from failure, was waiting just around the corner. And this time he was ready for it. The truth about progress is that it never walks in a straight line. It climbs, it slips, it bruises you when you least expect it. Ethan had built momentum, discipline, self-control, mindfulness, but life was about to remind him that order never lasts forever. His company had been planning a major marketing rollout. Ethan had taken charge of a small team, his first leadership role. He made schedules, checklists, timelines, everything neat, color-coded, flawless. For weeks he worked late, convinced this was his moment to prove how far he'd come. Then the cracks started showing. A designer missed deadlines. A client changed requirements mid-week. The copywriter quit. Ethan stayed up nights patching holes, rewriting presentations, skipping workouts, ignoring sleep. The same walls that had once held his progress now trapped him. On the day of the final review, the project was still half done. His manager's voice was ice. "Ethan, this isn't ready. What happened to your discipline?" That word stung more than the criticism. Discipline. The very thing he'd built his new life around. He went home that night without turning on the lights. The city glowed outside his window, indifferent. His wall chart, the one full of proud check marks, looked foreign now, like it belonged to someone else. He pulled the book from his shelf and flipped it open to the next chapter. Learn from failures. The first line stared back at him like an old truth he'd ignored. Failure is not the opposite of discipline. It is a teacher disguised as pain. He sat in silence for a long time. The chapter continued. Most people fear failure because they believe it erases their progress, but every setback contains a map if you have the patience to read it. That sentence felt personal, like the author was speaking directly to him across time. He took out his notebook and wrote down everything that went wrong. The missed meetings, the poor delegation, the moments he tried to do everything alone because he didn't trust others to get it right. By the time he finished, his hand hurt, but so did his ego, and that was good. He realized he'd been confusing control with perfection. He wanted his plan so tight that nothing could fall apart. But life didn't care about plans. It cared about growth. And growth needed friction. The next morning, he walked into the office early, earlier than everyone else. He didn't apologize or make excuses. He gathered his team and said, "We failed because I tried to do it all. That's on me. But we'll fix it together." It wasn't heroic. It was human. And strangely, that honesty made people listen. They reworked the project, deadlines shifted, energy returned. By the end of the week, the campaign launched, not perfect, but functional. His manager stopped by his desk. "Good recovery," he said quietly. "I like how you handled it." That night, Ethan wrote 3 new words on his wall chart: reflect, adjust, repeat. Days later, while cleaning his desk, he found an old sticky note that said, "Don't fail again." He laughed, peeled it off and replaced it with a new one. "Fail smarter next time." He finally understood what the chapter meant when it said, "Discipline isn't about never falling, it's about refusing to stay down." He'd fallen, yes, hard. But now failure had a different shape. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a mirror. The next weekend, as rain trickled down his window, he read the final lines of the chapter. Each failure refines you. Each mistake strips away what you're not, and what remains if you keep showing up is strength. He closed the book, leaned back in his chair and whispered, "I can live with that." Because for the first time, he wasn't afraid to fail again. After the chaos faded, Ethan's life settled into something quieter, not perfect, not easy, but steady. His mornings still started early, but now without the pressure to win the day. He ran, he worked, he read. Some days he moved mountains. Other days he barely moved at all, but he kept showing up. And that, he realized, was the difference. One night, while cleaning his apartment, he came across a page in How to Be Disciplined that he hadn't reached yet. The title read, Consistency. The first line felt like the author had been saving it just for him. Motivation starts the engine. Consistency keeps the car moving, even when you don't feel like driving. He smiled. That was it. His entire problem wrapped in one sentence. He had always chased excitement, not endurance. Every time he'd tried to change before, he'd burned out as soon as the rush faded. He read on. You don't need intensity every day, you need presence. Show up tired, show up imperfect, show up late if you must. But show up. He closed the book and looked at his wall chart. Rows of tiny boxes, hundreds of them, each one a small act of resistance against giving up. Together they told the story of someone who kept coming back again and again. So he made a promise to himself, no matter how good or bad a day went, he'd do one small thing that pushed him forward. The next morning he woke up late. The old Ethan would have said, well, the day's ruined. But instead he brewed his coffee, grabbed his sneakers, and went for a short 10-minute jog. Not the full run, not the full plan, just something. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. That became his new rule. Bad day? Do one small thing. Exhausted? Do one small thing. Not in the mood? Still, one small thing. Weeks passed, and his habits stopped feeling like obligations. They became part of who he was. When he skipped something, it felt off, like forgetting to lock the door or brush his teeth. At work, his consistency started to show too. Colleagues came to him when they needed something reliable, a steady hand, a calm answer, a quiet solution. His boss noticed. "You've changed," she said one afternoon. Ethan smiled. Not really. I just stopped stopping." He didn't say it to impress her. He said it because it was true. One evening, while journaling, he wrote, "Motivation is like falling in love. Consistency is like staying married." He laughed at his own metaphor, but couldn't deny how right it felt. Consistency didn't feel exciting. It wasn't fireworks or applause. It was brushing your teeth when no one's watching. It was turning off Netflix when your body begged for distraction. It was rewriting one paragraph of a plan you might not even use. And yet, that invisible work, the kind no one ever sees, was building something real. One Sunday morning, he stood by the window with a cup of coffee, watching people rush down the street below. He realized that he didn't crave chaos anymore. He didn't need to prove anything to himself or anyone else. He just needed to keep going. He opened the book again, and a final line from the chapter pulled him in. "Discipline is not about speed. It's about direction. Consistency keeps you pointed toward your purpose." He closed the book slowly, tracing the cover with his thumb. Then, quietly, he whispered, "Direction. I can do that." That night he went to bed early, not because he was tired, but because tomorrow was another day to keep showing up. He didn't know it yet, but this steady rhythm, this quiet commitment, was what would change his life more than any plan, goal, or spark of inspiration ever had. Because success wasn't waiting for him somewhere out there. He was already living it, one ordinary, consistent day at a time. Months passed. Seasons changed. Ethan's wall calendar filled and refilled. His sneakers wore down at the edges. His life wasn't loud anymore. It had rhythm. There was no rush, no panic, no chasing of miracles. Just the soft repetition of effort. One evening in late autumn, he came home after work, dropped his bag, and stood in front of the same wall where everything had begun. The paper chart still hung there, its corners curling from time. Beneath it, his old notebook sat open, the first page yellowed a little, ink fading. At the top, he'd written, "Goals." Below it, "Lose weight, learn new skills, read 5 books a month." He smiled. He hadn't hit every number. He hadn't stayed flawless. But the person who'd written that list no longer existed, replaced by someone calmer, stronger, quieter. He sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and stared at the notebook. It wasn't pride he felt, it was gratitude. Every missed alarm, every small failure, every night he didn't give up. They'd all shaped him. He flipped through the pages and found his early notes, frantic, impatient, full of commands to fix everything. Then he compared them to his recent entries, slower handwriting, softer words like balance, patience, presence. Somewhere along the way, the war had ended. He realized he didn't crave motivation anymore. He didn't need pep talks or challenges. What he needed was already inside him, the quiet decision to keep doing what mattered. The next morning, he went for his usual run. The air was sharp and cold, leaves crunched beneath his shoes. He noticed how his breathing fell into sync with his steps, how the streetlights blinked off one by one as dawn took over the sky. It felt less like exercise and more like prayer. Later that day, a co-worker asked him for advice on focus. Ethan laughed. "You don't find focus," he said. "You build it, one boring day at a time." That night, he brewed tea and sat by his window, watching the city shimmer beneath a lazy drizzle. He pulled How to Be Disciplined from the shelf and traced the spine. The book looked worn now, pages dog-eared, margin notes everywhere. It had traveled with him through every stage of this transformation. He opened to a random line near the back. Transformation isn't loud. It happens quietly, the way dawn replaces darkness, not all at once, but moment by moment. He read it twice, then he whispered, "That's exactly how it felt." He thought about the man he used to be, chasing shortcuts, drowning in distractions, mistaking movement for progress. Now his life was slower, but fuller. He had time for people, time for silence, time for himself. In that moment, Ethan realized something profound. Discipline had never been about becoming someone else. It had always been about returning to who he was supposed to be, before the noise, before the chaos. He closed the book and stared out the window. The city lights reflected faintly in the glass, overlapping his own reflection. For the first time, he looked at himself and didn't see someone who needed fixing. He saw someone in motion, imperfect, steady, alive. He whispered to himself, "This is it. This is what I was chasing all along." Outside, the rain slowed. The streetlights blurred in soft halos of gold. He stayed there for a long time, letting the quiet fill the room. He knew the journey wasn't over. The final chapter was still waiting, a lesson not about doing more, but about being more. Tomorrow, he would open the last page, and this time he wouldn't be searching for answers. He'd be reading his own reflection back at him. Winter had returned. The air outside was cold enough to turn breath into mist. Inside his apartment, Ethan sat by the same window where this entire story had begun. The city was quieter now, or maybe he was. On the table beside him lay the book that had been his silent companion through every failure, lesson, and sunrise, How to Be Disciplined by Sheldon Howe. He flipped to the final chapter. Its title read simply, "The Journey Never Ends." He smiled, almost amused. "Of course it doesn't," he whispered. The first paragraph said, "People chase discipline as if it's a destination. But it's not. It's a conversation between who you are and who you want to be, repeated every single day." He paused. That line didn't just sound true, it felt true, because even now, after months of structure and effort, he still had off days. He still procrastinated sometimes. He still doubted himself. But unlike before, he no longer saw those moments as failure. They were just part of the rhythm. He turned the page. "The secret to lasting change," it said, "isn't intensity. It's persistence, not running fast but walking far." He leaned back in his chair, remembering how far he'd already walked. The man who once snoozed alarms and avoided hard truths was gone. In his place was someone who showed up, tired or not, ready or not, motivated or not. He stood up and walked over to his wall, the one where his old chart still hung. It looked worn out, full of scribbles and tape marks. For a moment, he thought about taking it down. Then he decided not to. It wasn't a tracker anymore. It was a reminder of how far he'd come and how much further he could still go. He picked up a pen and wrote one last line across the bottom. "Keep showing up." It was simple, but it was everything. That evening, Ethan made himself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the moonlight scatter across the rooftops. The city shimmered like it was whispering back his own story. Not of perfection, but of progress. He thought about all the lessons the book had given him. Setting goals gave him direction. Routine gave him rhythm. Self-control gave him strength. Mindfulness gave him calm. Failure gave him wisdom. Consistency gave him growth. And together they gave him peace. He realized something then. Discipline wasn't about becoming unbreakable. It was about learning to bend without falling apart. It wasn't about control. It was about awareness. It wasn't about chasing success. It was about becoming someone who deserved it. He closed the book slowly. Its cover was scratched, its corners bent, but that only made it feel more alive, like it had lived the journey with him. He whispered to himself, "Thank you." Not to the author, not even to the book, but to the version of himself who never quit, even when it didn't seem worth it. Then, as the night deepened, he picked up his notebook and began to write again. Not goals this time, reflections, thoughts, gratitude, a quiet note to the future. Discipline didn't change my life overnight. It just made me show up long enough for life to change itself. He smiled as he wrote the last line. "I'm still on the road, and that's exactly where I want to be." Outside, the first snowflakes of the season drifted past his window, silent and soft, a reminder that every ending is just the start of another rhythm. And with that, he closed his notebook, took one last sip of tea and let the city hum him to sleep, knowing that tomorrow he'd rise again. Not perfectly, but faithfully, because the journey never ends.